Okay, so let's finish up on this unit by looking at the last stage of the project, the closing phase. Generally speaking, in a project management context, closing of the project, there's a number of ways that a project can be wound up. It may be that you've delivered on goals, your objectives, and you've met your targets on budget, on time, and on quality. And the project has come to its natural conclusion. And that would be a terrific conclusion where you've really ticked off all the boxes and you've had a successful outcome. But projects can also be wrapped up for other reasons. So, for example, you may not have delivered on goals or objectives or targets, but still sorry, I should say, you may have delivered on goals and objectives, but not the target. So you may have achieved the general objective of the project and achieved the key goals, but you may have spent more than you anticipated, or it may have taken you a little bit more time, or perhaps the quality has had to have been compromised in certain areas, and that can still be considered a success under depending on the circumstances and who's made those calls and what are the causal factors to or contributors to the targets not being met. Projects can sometimes also be closed, though, even if the goals and the objectives have not been delivered or the targets, and that may be in cases where the project is just spiraling out of control. For example, Wembley Stadium issues where you're not meeting any of your targets. You're continually overspending. You're continually over exceeding your time commitments, and you're not meeting your quality targets. And the achievement of the project goal or objective is nowhere in sight, and sometimes the investors or the sponsors will say, that's it, we've had enough, we're not sinking any more money into this, and we're going to cut our losses. As a project manager, sometimes those factors are out of your control, and this relates as well equally if you're a project officer. You may well have managed your accountabilities really well, but for a number of different circumstances or causal factors or contributing factors out of your control, the project has not been successful on all fronts. So for example, you're halfway through a project and there's been a significant transition in the business, and your project is no longer deemed to be in line with its strategic direction. So you're instructed to wind it up halfway through your project, even though you're nowhere near delivering on any of the outcomes. Or there's been a change of management, and with that comes a change of financial focus, and all of a sudden the money that you have is greatly reduced. So there are a number of factors like that can impact. And one of the things about being an effective project officer or project manager is being able to go, okay, look, what's in my control? This is in my control in terms of I can realign my plans. I can consult with my key stakeholders. I can redo my schedules. I can get all this stuff signed off again, and just work with the shift with the new parameters that I've been given, and really let go of those issues that are really out of your control. And though you can acknowledge that they're frustrating, you say, look, that's really out of my control, and I'm not going to be hyper fixated on it. That's really nothing I can do about that, but this is what I can do. And this is really where we start talking about proactive and reactive behaviors in terms of where we anchor our problem solving perspective. And being proactive as a project manager in particular is really dealing with issues and problems starting from the point of what I can control. And there's a number of things we've just been talking about throughout this unit. Again, I go back to that point that a project is usually a one-off. It's not business as usual. So the idea of closure or closing phase is this idea that we have to tie off the loose ends so that we can have closure on this project, so that we can go on to whatever it is that we do next. So if we're in a leadership role within a government organisation, and we have a task, we've been issued with a task, or we generate a task we're going to approach with a project management methodology, at some point we want to draw a line in the sand and say, okay, that's it. I'm completed with this project now. And it's no longer going to take up any of my energy because it's not business as usual. It's not my day-to-day responsibilities and accountabilities. So that's if you're working in that context. If you're working in a project management space, you've got to close off this project so that you can then start working at your next project, whatever that may be. So the concept of closure or closing the project is really critical, because here is where you as the senior officer or the project manager or just the person responsible for your part of the project, where you say, that's it, I am finished, I'm handing it back to you, sponsor. So if you're the project manager and you're reporting to the project sponsor, when you finish the closing phase, you're actually and you completed your report, you're going to hand it back to the sponsor and say, I'm done. In this report, we'll cover off what has been done, what has been achieved, what is outstanding, but now it's your responsibility. I'm going on to whatever my next endeavor is. So that's in that theoretical project management space. But as a senior officer, you might say, okay, I'm closing off this project. I'm going through the proper protocols on methodologies for closing a project, because I want to be able to sign this project off and not have to have that take up any more of my energy or time. So there's some steps that we need to do to make sure that we can do that comfortably. And that is, we need to make sure that we tie off all our loose ends. So the project, it's either come to its natural conclusion, or it's been, or we've had instructions to wrap it up. There are things that we need to do. We need to make sure that we complete on all the final deliverables. So we need to make sure that whatever the deliverables that have been achieved have been completed. We make sure that we release all our resources. So if we've hired any physical resources, we need to take them back and collect things like deposits or any other financial commitments that we've invested. If we've purchased resources and they're no longer required, well, then we need to disperse of those. However, whatever the protocol is within your organization. If we've hired people for the project, we need to do the same type of thing, wind up those contracts, and disperse of those human resources. If they're designated project teams, we need to then reallocate them to whatever the next project that they're working on may be. We need to finalize the financials. We need to make sure that all the invoices have been paid and collected. We need to make sure the remunerations has been paid. We need to make sure the contractors have been paid. We need to, as I said before, recover any money that's been used as deposits anywhere along the project timeline. And importantly, we need to let everyone know where we're at with the project. So we need to communicate what the outcomes have been. So one, we need to let people know that we're wrapping it up, what the steps are, but then we need to say, here's where we're at with it. This is what the final results may have been, but also to let people know these are the steps that we're taking to wrap everything up, if that's appropriate. As part of the wrap up as well, and I've talked about this through the course of this unit, but as part of the wrap up, we also need to start to make sure that we gather a body of knowledge around our project. We need to gather anything that can be useful for us to use as a footprint on the project, which can be used again in the future for similar type projects. And it may be that we may endeavor in something similar again in the future, and the body of knowledge is going to be really useful for us. Or it may be that someone else in the organization or in our industry can benefit from our experience. So we start to gather and capture information that includes hard data, such as copies of project plans and risk management plans and so forth, but also some of the soft stuff. So we'll consult with our project team and some key stakeholders, ask them about their experience, lessons learned, and so forth. And I'll come back to this shortly. We need to evaluate the project. So we need to undertake an evaluation on what was successful, what was not so successful, what worked well, what didn't work so well, and then we need to write up a final report that we hand back to the sponsor that outlines everything that is wrapped up as part of the project. And again, I'll break that down for you shortly. And then we need to get, particularly on the sponsor, we need to get them to sign off on that. So when we do our final report, which outlines what's been achieved and what is outstanding, the sponsor then signs off on it to acknowledge that they then take responsibility for that. So they're really the big steps that we take in terms of the wrap up. I talked through the content of this slide a moment ago when I was talking about the different steps, but just to sort of say the phase out or the close out of the closing phase is really about just making sure that we finalize all activities in the project so that there's no ongoing activities once we've completed the project. Not within our accountability. The sponsor may make a decision to continue on some activities, but then they have to allocate resources and take responsibility for that. But from our perspective, it's where we sort of complete all those outstanding project activities. And as I said, that includes things like tying up all our financial assets, any liabilities or any paperwork associated with payments or invoices and so forth. We also making sure that we record data, but as I mentioned earlier, that disbursement of physical resources as well. I know I talked a little bit about the human resources a couple of slides back, but I just want to park on this for a second and just really just dig down a little bit on it. So I talked about dispersing our physical resources, and I talked about a couple of slides ago. I talked about dispersing our human resources, saying like if we've got contract staff that we let them go, if we've got project team, professional project team members that we then allocate them to new projects. But I just want to stop and talk about the human element of this as well, because if you've worked on a project or if you've led a project, you'll be familiar with the idea that it does take quite a bit of emotional investment to work on some particularly challenging projects, where because of the nature of it, because it's something that's it's unusual, we don't necessarily have a lot of heritage on it. It's a very dynamic workspace. Things are changing all the time, and often people have to invest, have to go over and above the call of duty, so to speak. And it's not unusual for that to happen, especially like in different sectors, you've got terminology for it. So if you're familiar with the gaming sector, for example, in video and computer games, you've got this crunch concept, where as we get towards deadlines, people get really put under the pump to meet those deadlines and so forth. And every industry sort of has a variation of that, hopefully in a more ethical manner than what you hear about the crunch in that particular industry. But it is a high level of emotional investment, usually for people working within many projects. And one of as a leader, as a project manager or a senior project officer, one of your key responsibilities as a leader is about making sure that we look after our people. And part of looking after our people is making sure that we do the right thing when we wrap up the project. So making sure that we nurture and we care for the human element of the people working on that project. So part of a project close-up is the disbanding of the project team. And that can be an internal team, but it can also include external stakeholders such as contractor staff or temporary hire staff and so forth. But they're still part of the project team. And as a leader and a manager, you have a responsibility to make sure that we give people proper closure on the project so that they feel that their contributions have been acknowledged and have been worthwhile and valuable. And that's going to lead into things such as, people have good experience, hopefully, and that'll lead them into, putting their hand up for future projects or opportunities that are very similar. So the things that you can do as a leader and as a project officer or a project manager is that you can make sure that as part of your planning process that you think about how you're going to acknowledge and show your appreciation for people's contributions as you wrap up the project. Common ways that this is done is through things such as project wrap-up get-togethers. So you might have like a morning tea or a barbecue lunch or even just a social event where where people involved in the project can get together, and you may have some type of loose agenda of storytelling, where people can get the opportunity to talk about some of the more lighter moments or challenging moments, and people will have a chance to recognize the challenges and have a bit of that peer support and debrief from it. Those type of social gatherings or events as part of the closure phase can be really valuable in terms of giving project team members the opportunity to feel like their contributions have been acknowledged and appreciated, and as I said, that reinforces some positive behaviours going forward. You can also do things such as I talked about. Importantly, I just talked about previously about creating and gathering a body of knowledge. You can even tie those up into things such as those social events. So you can do something like a morning tea or a luncheon, and as part of that, you might tack onto the start of that a project debrief, where you might get the group together and have some type of facilitated environment where you might get the team to think about things that worked well, things that didn't work so well, things that we could do differently if we had the opportunity again, and so forth and so forth. And you can have something like that at the start, and then do the social event at the end, or you can have a bit of a morning tea social event, and then tack on at the end of that something such as an information gathering process. Those type of things, I don't want to be too prescriptive about those things, because depending on the culture of the workplace, the dynamics of the workplace, policies and procedures around those type of gatherings and information gathering, all those factors contribute to what's best for your circumstances. But as a lead in a project, it's something that you need to consider as a closing phase in this idea of, it's one thing to take back machinery and say thank you very much. It's another thing to disperse of teams. And you've got, there are some theoretical models like Tuckman's 5 stages of development that talk about what the data shows in terms of what the emotions and the feelings that people have when they disband and so forth, and what are the best ways to deal with that. So we can use, we can use an evidence-based approach to deal with this, but it's really important to acknowledge, making sure that we recognize and making sure that we show our appreciation. And so just in terms of wrapping up on some of those information gathering steps that I talked about earlier, one of those important elements of the wrap-up, particularly around information, is financial information and financial performance. So it's important as well as part of the close, because often the close phase of a project is where we gather up all the invoices that need to be paid and so forth. It's important that we take extra care to make sure that the data that we're using and the data that we're feeding into the systems is accurate, complete, and up to date. So making sure that we're passing all the invoices, making sure that we're double checking the details, making sure that all those bits and pieces are correct, because at the end of the project, often people are pretty tired, and the likelihood of errors and the risk of the errors increase. So as a leader in this space, you need to make sure that we're having an eye for detail on these things. Typical errors that happen across the board. So this is not just government project, but across the board in terms of the project space. Are things like underpaid or overpaid invoices, where invoices are passed multiple times, so they get paid multiple times, where incorrect details, especially around payments, are provided, and therefore people don't get paid correctly, and just entering incorrect data into databases such as any of the accounting systems that you have and so forth. and that includes things like cost centers, allocating particular project costs to the correct cost center so that the financial reporting is correct. And I mentioned about the project closure report. Now, this is really important. And again, every organization, when we talk about large organizations, will have their own templates and protocols around this. So working within a specific government department or agency, your department or agency will have a template report for closing up the final report on the project, and it'll have different sections within there that you'll be prescribed on what to fill in and whatnot. But generally speaking, the closure report should provide sufficient information that the sponsor can then make an informed decision about taking the project back. So if they need to know what's been achieved, what has been successful, what has not been successful, but they also need to know if there's any outstanding things that they need to be aware of, so they can then take accountability for that. And it's also documented evidence that you have handed it over properly. So the report should include things such as the title of the project, who it's prepared by. Should have a sign-off section so that the sponsor can sign off and take responsibility for it. Because it's a report, it should have an executive summary that summarizes the content. Within the content, you should have a description of the project. You should outline the performance of the project, and that might be against your goals, your objectives, and your targets. You would also describe any outstanding tasks and what needs to happen with those in your recommendations. In your opinion. And you should also have recommendations that need to happen going forward. So that can tie in with your outstanding tasks. These things are outstanding. These are my recommendations for dealing with those things. And then we have a lessons learned, and that is what our experience has taught us on this project and any recommendations that we're making going forward for similar projects. And then a wrap-up, a summary. But as I said, be guided by whatever the template or the pro forma is in your organization. But that's the type of main components that you'll find in a closure report.